I just can't believe that a loving God would send people to hell. I just can't believe that there is a loving God with so much suffering in this world. How could that be if God is loving? These are the types of questions that many wrestle with. And they are difficult questions. For some, these questions have caused them to make a decision about Jesus, and they've decided that God is not good, and they've left him. But for others who have experienced God, they may wrestle sometimes with questions like this. They may doubt because there is so much suffering in this world. And sometimes when we hear about some of the things that happen in this world, or we experience it ourselves, we're lost and we're left without words to express the suffering. And at such times we may doubt, is God good? Because these questions about suffering have an underlying theme. And that theme is that when we think about God, we know that he is powerful. We know that he is almighty. And we have to wrestle with this reconciliation between, on one hand, a very good, loving God, and on the other hand, suffering. So at this Christmas time, we look at the Christmas story, and we consider these questions. And we ask, is God good? Can he be trusted? So as we begin, I'd like to start with a story. I'd like to introduce you to Marilyn, Ming, and Joseph. Now, Marilyn and Joseph lived on the same street, and Marilyn grew up with Joseph and his wife living next door. They had wonderful times together. They would go over to their house, they'd have milk and cookies, Joseph and his wife would help them with their homework, so they had a really, really strong bond with that family. But then it came time that Marilyn grew up and she moved away to university. She was gone for quite a long time. But then she came back home one day for a visit and was at the local coffee shop, and behold, who did she run into? Joseph. It was a warm, warm, warm embrace. And as usual, when an older person meets a younger person, they usually say, "Oh my goodness, you've grown so much." And the younger person may think in their mind, "And you've gotten so old." But Marilyn didn't say that. But they were catching up with each other. But Marilyn quickly noticed that something just wasn't right about Joseph. He had a bead of sweat on his forehead, and she noticed the slightest twitch in his mouth. And before she can even fully consider what's happening, bang, he just collapses. And she literally catches him and brings him down to the ground and starts to assess what is going on here. And at just that moment, Ming, who's a couple of tables over in this coffee shop, sees the commotion, jumps up to his feet, runs over to what's happening, and Marilyn is down there, and she's just about to start giving this Joseph CPR, when Ming just comes up to the front, elbows his way up, and says, "I've got first aid, no worry, I'm in charge." And he kind of pushes her over and starts doing CPR. He commands someone to call the paramedics, they come. And sure enough, this is a very serious situation. And they come up and they take over, they give him some shocks, his heart rhythm begins to start, his heart begins beating again, and then the tension in the room just releases, and everyone breathes a sigh of relief. The paramedics quickly get him ready to go to the hospital, and they turned to Ming and said, "Hey, you saved a life today." Ming is elated. He's so happy. People are patting him on the back, giving him high fives, and that's great. And he's talking to people about what just happened, and then he turns to Marilyn, and he's talking about what happened. He says, "Hey, by the way, do you have CPR too?" And she turns to him and says, "Actually, I'm a medical doctor." Ming is humiliated and embarrassed. He's at a loss for words. But Marilyn, in her graciousness, recognizes this and tries to make the situation a little better. She just taps him on the shoulder and says, "I was watching you. If you weren't doing a good job with the CPR, I would take over." But this was not the time or the place to argue about who was to take leadership. And as she walks away, Ming thinks to himself, she was the real hero. Now, when we think about this story, We look at Marilyn, and whether or not you actually believe she was the real hero, you must admit she showed a noble character. She was able to put herself second to the situation because she put someone else's needs ahead of hers. She wasn't so concerned about getting the fame or getting the glory or being the one in charge. And this is called humility. What is humility? It's strength under control. It's putting others ahead of ourselves. When we have humility, we signal to other people that we are safe. Because if we're willing to put someone else's needs ahead of ours, if we're willing to get down in the trenches with them, we give the message that we are safe, that we are trustworthy. Humility also strengthens social bonds because a humble person is quick to ask for forgiveness. A humble person embraces forgiveness. A humble person takes responsibilities for their actions, and they're not blaming other people. So what is it about humility that on one hand, we acknowledge it, we value it, when we see it in other people, we say, wow, this is really noble. But on the other hand, we really hate humility because we really are socialized to be like Ming. And there are some reasons why humility is so difficult, and here's one of them. We live in a very individualistic society. We have an individualistic worldview. And we can't escape this society because we are in it. And it affects all of us in one way or another. So we need to be aware of it because it does work against humility. Some of the values we have in our society are independence, self-reliance, autonomy, uniqueness, and we value the rights of the individual. Now, all of these things are good, but when taken to an extreme, they work against humility. Because the message that we will then get is that we need to be prideful. We need to get in there just like Ming was. Ming didn't even think that the possibility that that person who was giving CPR was actually better qualified than he was. Those thoughts would not even enter the mind of Ming. There's another reason why that humility is difficult, other than the fact that, that we tend to be in the center of our universe, is this. It's a verse in the Bible, and it comes from Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah was a prophet, and in the book of Jeremiah in the Bible is like 52 chapters long, and it's this constant conversation between Jeremiah and God about the way the Israelites were living, and how they were disobeying God, and they were just living in a way that displeased God. And at one point, God says to Jeremiah, "The human heart is the most deceitful of all things, and desperately wicked. Who really knows how bad it is?" And that is a reality. When we have hearts that are so evil, we tend to be selfish. We tend to look at our needs. We tend to be self-centered. We look at the world around us through the lens of who we are, our preferences, our desires, the things that we like, the things that we value, the way it's my way or the highway. That's the way we live it. We can't even conceive of another perspective. And what is it about then, this tension of humility between a good God and the suffering, between the value that we see in humility, that we respect it when we see it in other people, but then we find it so hard? It's because humility is the way of love. Jesus humbled himself to an unparalleled extent to show us his love for him. Let's start with a verse that talks about this. And it comes from Philippians 2, verses 6 to 8. And this is Paul talking to the people of Philippi, the church at Philippi, and he says to them, "You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had." Okay? So he's talking to them, saying, our attitude should be this. It should be the same as Christ. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took on the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in a human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God, and died a criminal's death on the cross. We read this sometimes, and it may not really hit us because we can't imagine what he gave up, because we have no idea what heaven is like. We've not been there. We read about it in Scripture, and we can imagine, but we don't know. We don't know. We can read that he was equal with God, and he gave that up. And we can try to imagine what that is, but we don't know. However, we do know, because we've experienced what the world is like down here. So let's take this further and look at what God gave up. We know he gave up his deity. He was equal with God. He is God. He's living in heaven when angels are praising him day and night. As Suzanne prayed, 24/7, 365, and not one or two little angels. We're talking upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands. He gave that all up. He gave up all his power. But let's now look at what it looks like on the earth. Things we have experience with, things that we can really understand because we've touched them and we've felt them and we've experienced them. Let's talk about his humble birth. Because as we look at his humble birth at this time of Christmas, we're going to focus on the way of humility. There's a little church in Portugal called St. Francis. It's in Évora, Portugal. And it has a little museum. And in this little museum, there are about 3,000 nativity scenes. 3,000, that's a lot. And they encompass every possible way that people can imagine the nativity scene. There are some that are intricate and made of fine materials. There are others that are a little bit more rustic. There are some that are flashy, and there are some that are simple. There are some that represent people of every culture, of every nation. And as I looked upon these, they were really nice, but they all had one thing in common. And it's the same thing that's in the little nativity scene outside in our lobby, and all the nativity scenes we see around us. They're sterile. They've been romanticized. The figures are so clean and perfect. But that was very different from what happened in the first Christmas. So first of all, let's talk about the location, all right? The location of the nativity. Where did it all take place? You ever wonder how sometimes it's kind of funny that we as humans have a lot about, some of us have a lot of pride about where we were born. I'm Canadian, or I'm Greek, or whatever it is. And on the other hand, some of us have shame from where we were born because the place where we were born is not so much valued in our society. But the reality is we have no choice about that. Whether it is a place that we came from that is valued in our society or a place that's not so valued, we don't have a choice about that. It had nothing to do with us and everything to do with just so happened to be in the geographical spot where your mother was. That's it, nothing else. But yet we take it on because it really does define us. Jesus had a choice. Why didn't he choose the business center or the fashion center or the cultural center of the time? Years before Jesus was born, years before, centuries before, there was a prophecy that was made, and it's recorded in Micah. And it reads, "But you, O Bethlehem, are only a small village among all the people of Judah, yet a ruler of Israel, whose origins are in the distant past, will come from you on my behalf." He chose Bethlehem. So before the creation of this world, before all of this happened, centuries before, it's been prophesied that this great leader is going to come from Bethlehem. And Bethlehem was a very small place. It wasn't a place that was on the map. It wasn't a place that you would really know about if you weren't from the area, okay? And he chose the least. That's very interesting because right there, he's telling us about who he is. God is after the least. God puts himself last. God is not out there making a name for himself. He already has that name because of the price he paid for our salvation. So now let's go in. So it's in Bethlehem. And for Mary and Joseph, who lived in Nazareth, they had to make this 144-kilometer trip to Bethlehem because the political situation at that time was that everyone was called to report to their place of birth and to their home country so that they could register for this census. They were walking, and if you consider that people may have covered 16 kilometers in a day, it would have been a 9-day trek for the average person. And we complain about going online and filling out a form for our census. This was very difficult. And for Mary and Joseph, they may have thought to themselves, wow, this couldn't have come at a worse time. Mary's in her 3rd trimester, and she's going to have a baby any day. And they have to make this trek. It was not an easy trek. And they may have looked at it and said, the circumstances is really hard for us. But in reality, they had to do that. How was God going to move Mary and Joseph from Nazareth to Bethlehem? Because that's where Jesus was going to be born. So the world around us, the circumstances we find ourselves in sometimes, we may think they're really bad, but God has a purpose behind them. God had a purpose for moving Mary and Joseph from Nazareth to Bethlehem and taking that long journey. And as they traveled along this journey, there's something that really stands out to me, and probably you've noticed it too. Everybody had to go to their home places to be registered for this census. That would mean Mary and Joseph's family were also going. That would mean people that they know, friends, relatives, also had to make the trek, that 144 trek. They knew that Joseph and Mary were about to have their first child. Where were those people? This is ancient Middle East. Hospitality is one of the greatest values that they had. Caring for your family is one of the greatest values that they had. Where were they? Did not anybody say, I'll walk with you? Or did not anybody think, hey, Mary, Joseph, I'll go ahead of you and reserve a room for you? Or better yet, when Mary and Joseph arrived, was there no one that said, hey, you need this room more than I do, take it? They were alone. It wasn't a romanticized experience. It was a difficult experience. Jesus chose to go to an out-of-the-way place, an unknown place to be born in. He chose a very simple couple who had said yes to God to be born from them. And one of the reasons why possibly the family wasn't around was because Mary and Joseph had been outcasts. People looked down on them because they were in a situation that they were expecting a child, but they weren't married. Whoa, in this culture, that was awful. So all of a sudden, the values of hospitality, the values of taking care of your family are kind of put aside because of this thing that's sitting on top of them, that people look at them and look down at them. And therefore, Jesus being born from this family also has that stigma on his. He's the child of the outcasts. He's an outcast himself. So Jesus comes in this way, showing us who he is. He's at the bottom. He's giving up everything. He's aligning himself with those who are on the periphery of society, with the nobodies of the world, because he loves us so much. Let's look at the manger now, or the actual place where they rested. They arrive in Bethlehem. It's bustling with activity. All these people are coming into the city because they need to register for the census. There's no place. But for typical Middle Eastern hospitality, the innkeeper doesn't want to turn them away. So he says, I have no room, but there's some space with the animals. Now, when we think of animals, you may think of barns like you see when you're running through rural Ontario, but that's not what we're looking at. A place where the animals were kept in ancient Middle Eastern times would have probably been maybe a cave, maybe it would have been a lean-to against the building, or maybe it would actually be in the very inside the building itself. Maybe if it had a second story, on the upper level, the people would live, but as you walk in the first level, there may be an area where the animals are actually kept right there. Okay? So if for Mary and Joseph, and they're having their child, they may have not had privacy. they were with the animals. So, think about that. They're with a bunch of animals. It smells like animals. It smells like manure. They may have to pick their spots so they wouldn't step in manure. They had to find an area to actually lie down. It's a place of animals. Animals eat our leftovers foods, so there's rotting vegetables around. Who's attracted to rotting vegetables? Mice? Rats? Creepy crawlers of all sorts? Yes. Is it humid in there? Well, depending on the number of animals and all their breathing, yes, it may have been humid. It's dark. It's not a pleasant place. It's dirty. And that's where Jesus chose to make his grand entrance into our world. Why? Because that's who he is. He has the power. He has all of it, and he set it all aside to show us how much he loves us. Yes, there's so much suffering in the world, but that was never God's intent for us. And right through the Old Testament, he's constantly trying to tell us, this is who I am. He does it through the law. He does it through the various people he speaks through. This is who I am. Because people have come up with different ideas about who God is. And their ideas are warped, and they're terrible caricatures of who God is. And this now is the pinnacle of God's plan. God himself coming to us in the most humble form to say, I'm humble, I'm trustworthy, I love you. And this is a great news. And this is what we remind ourselves at Christmas time. Yes, we celebrate Christmas every single year. And many of you may have celebrated many, many, many Christmases over your lifetime. But each time, it's a time to remember. Based on everything we've experienced throughout that year, we may have those moments where we doubt. We may have those struggles. But we can remind ourselves, this was never God's plan for us. But instead, he comes and he stands right beside me and identifies with who I am. He is so humble. And the greater thing about this also is that it wasn't just his birth. Jesus took this humility and showed us right through his life that he was constantly humble. He was constantly going to the outcast. He was constantly lifting up the person who everybody else wanted to push down. He was constantly bringing justice to those who were being treated unjustly. This is who God is. Now let's fast forward a little bit and go to the end of his life. For we celebrated Christmas, his entrance into the world, which is the beginning of God's great plan for us. And was said earlier in the service for the children, God's rescue plan. So at Christmas, we're celebrating this. But then in a few months, we're going to celebrate Easter, which is the culmination of his plan, his actual death and resurrection. And what is he experiencing? We're experiencing his time with his disciples. He has now come to the end of his mission here on earth, and he's celebrating the last dinner supper with the apostles. He tells them that he has longed to celebrate this with them. And what are they doing? They began to argue among themselves about who would be the greatest among them. 3 years these people have followed Jesus. They've seen him walk on water. They've seen him do great miracles. They've seen his humility. They've experienced it firsthand. And still, they're arguing about who would be the greatest. They haven't got it. Okay? Jesus came in that humility to say, the world, we're upside down with what we value. We think that being the greatest is pushing ourselves forward, is getting to the top. And Jesus saying, no, it's coming to the bottom. It's being humble. So what does Jesus do? He's told them all he could tell them. He's been with them for 3 years. So better than telling them, he shows them. He washes their feet. Washing feet in this culture was something that you did when people arrived in your house. It was the etiquette, the proper thing to do. But it was a very, very humble position. It was a job that was given to slaves, but not only slaves. It was such a low job that Jews considered themselves too good to do it. So they gave it to non-Jews slaves. So even if you were a slave but you were Jewish, you wouldn't have that job. That's how low it was. But even so, it was lower than that. They usually gave it to the women because women were so low in that society. So it was a job that was given as people entered as proper etiquette to wash their feet, because in those days, people wore open-toed shoes, and the roads were very dusty. So Jesus gets up now, not at the beginning when they entered, but in the middle of the meal. He takes off his robe, and the King of Kings is crawling around dirty feet, taking up the job that is so low that Jews themselves do not want to do it. This is how humble he is. He's here to serve us. He's here to love us. And this incident at the table was the beginning of the 24 hours of showing God's great humility. Jesus then Judas has betrayed him. The soldiers come, they take him away, then starts his trial, and now he's before Pilate. And Pilate asks him many questions, and Jesus gives no answer. And Pilate says to him, "Don't you want to talk to me?" Pilate demanded. "Don't you realize I have the power to release you or to crucify you?" That's a very interesting question that Pilate asked him. And I want to give you a visual about what this might look like. There's Pilate sitting with all the authority of the state. And yes, he does hold that power to crucify or to release Jesus. He has it. Look at him there, sitting in a throne, what he's wearing, the emblems of power. He has it all. But in reality, Pilate is like that ant who's trying to fight that human. And that human just has to go like this, squash, and the ant is gone. That's where Pilate's power is in relation to eternity. And Jesus is like that hand who can squish Pilate if he wants to. All he has to do is say the word and there'd be a legion of angels there. But that would not be God's plan, because then he wouldn't die. And if he didn't die, he wouldn't rise. And if he didn't rise, we wouldn't know that he's conquered death and he's made a way for us. So this is the bottom line. We go back to our questions. Is God good? Can he be trusted? The way he came to this earth really reveals to us that yes, he's very good. We may not always have the answers to our suffering questions, but we can always take comfort to know that he's with us. He aligns himself with us in that suffering, that he's given up so much to suffer with us. And then we see it also as he goes to his whole ministry and he dies. And then he rises up from the dead. So the bottom line is that Jesus' humility from the manger to the cross is our greatest gain and our highest calling. It's our highest calling, so God wants us to do something about it. As we've been studying the way of Jesus, spending time with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, doing what Jesus does, let us come to that manger at this Christmas time. Spend time there. Smell the manure. Feel the stickiness of the air. Maybe watch the rat go by. Be there. Sit there. Become like Jesus. When that happened, the only person or the only people who came to Jesus was a bunch of shepherds who were in the field taking care of their sheep. And that in itself is so unique. Where were Joseph and Mary's relatives who had also come to Bethlehem? Didn't they want to congratulate the new parents? Didn't they want to hold the little baby and welcome him into the family? They weren't there. There was no fanfare. On this earth, there was nothing. But shepherds, who were also considered the lowliest of lowly jobs in that society, were the ones who Jesus himself, who God himself, gave the announcement. And you see this picture. They see this picture in the sky with thousands upon thousands of angels rejoicing. So in heaven, there's this great party going on, and on earth, the event went by with almost no notice at all. As we spend time with Jesus, let us become like him in that humility. The way of humility is what God is calling us to. What would this look like? As we sit in his presence and we meditate on what he has given up for us, we can have gratitude for all that he suffered. Accept this great gift that he's given to us, that we can't make our ways. We can't make a perfect world without him. That was the original sin, that we thought we can make a world without God. We are good enough. We can decide what's good and evil. And you know what? We can become equal to God. And that has proven to be a total disaster. We can't. We can't make it to heaven on our own. We can't say to ourselves, oh, I don't need church. I can be a good person. Because our definition of good is not good enough. As individuals living humbly, we can live secure in knowing that we are a child of God. Humility does not mean we're always making comments about ourselves that are debasing. No, that's not humility. That can be a sign of false humility, which is rooted in pride. But we know our strengths. We know our weaknesses. We know the gifts that God has given to us, but we stand underneath the shadow of the Almighty. We know that he is greater than we are. Humility is a thing of the heart. There's a parable in Scripture where two people go to God to the temple to pray. Two people. No one else is around. Okay? They're by themselves talking to God, between God and themselves. One of them is a Pharisee. And he says, oh, God, I'm thankful so much that you have made me this. And I'm not like that person who's so evil, or that person, and I'm not even like this tax collector over here. I fast twice a week, and I tithe. That was his prayer, just between him and God. The other person who went to the temple was a tax collector. And tax collectors were known for all the wrong they were doing. They tended to take more taxes than what was required, and they lined their own pockets. So yes, they were doing things that were wrong. And he prays, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And the parable goes on to say that it was that tax collector who went away justified. So humility starts with the heart. Can we surrender everything to God? Are we willing to allow God to enter into our thoughts, our preferences, our desires, our hopes, our dreams, and allow him to take it? Are we willing to say to God, show me my pride? Oh, if you pray that, he will show you your pride. And you will be shocked and devastated in how many ways it comes out, because our hearts are naturally proud. God's message has redefined for us what is valuable. Running after the approval of other people, trying to rise up the corporate ladder, all these things are not what God wants. I mean, it's fine to go up the corporate ladder. I'm not saying you shouldn't go up the corporate ladder if you're gifted and that's where you want to go. But if that's your only focus, and you think that that's all I need, and I need to get to that top, and I'm pushing people aside and running people under the bus just to get there, that's a different story. Jesus tells us that serving others is better than seeking self-glory. He's asking us to live differently, live counter-culture. Remember I told you, we are in this culture. We are in this individualistic culture, and it affects all of us. We need to live countercultural. Jesus lived that way. He was definitely willing to come and to be very humble and to know that others would look down at him, that others would despise him. He was willing to do that. We want to live a life that reflects his kingdom. How can we do that? Spend time with Christ. Empty ourselves. Be quick to ask pardon. Embrace forgiveness. Take responsibility for anything and everything you've done. Prioritize service over personal gain or status. Prioritize listening in our interpersonal relationships instead of talking. Go to the outcast. Go to the vulnerable. Go to the poor. Live in a way that honors them. When we're driving around or walking around, we see people begging. Do we just walk past them and not even look at them? Whether or not we give them something, the very, very least we could do is look in their eyes and say hello. Recognize their humanity. They feel like they don't exist when crowds of people walk by them day in and day out as though they're not there. Jesus goes to those outcasts. Jesus goes to that smelly manger. He's willing to go there. We need to be willing to go there too. When we completely die to self and care only for the opinion of one, we can show this level of humility. So let us do this Christmas. What actions will you take to embrace the humility of Christ in your life? Take some time to meditate on that. It could be something of the heart. It could be something more tangible. Here at Unionville, we will be starting the 14 Days of Light. Maybe that's where you want to start, something tangible, putting the needs of others before mine. Worship team, you can come up. But let us focus this Christmas season on that manger, on the humility of Jesus, and be reminded of his great, deep love for us. Be reminded, number one, that he is good, and number two, he can be trusted. Thank you.